Paul Newman exposed the golden age celebrities that were secretly gay before he passed away. The stars of Hollywood's golden age enthralled millions with their on-screen personas, but their private lives were meticulously concealed behind facades created by the company. One of the most well-liked actors of his day, Paul Newman, took secrets about his well-known co-workers to his grave that would permanently alter our perception of Hollywood history. The revelations he made in his last days drastically alter the perception of the biggest personalities of the time and show the extent to which studios will go in order to safeguard their priceless investments. Everything you believe to be true about Hollywood's most glitzy period would be called into doubt by what Newman knew about Rock Hudson, James Dean, and other legendary characters. You must first grasp a fundamental aspect of the world these stars inhabited before we can go into these astounding discoveries. A world in which your career could be abruptly ended by your personal truth, and the extent to which the studio system tried to conceal these secrets. Perhaps the most startling aspect of all is that it was 1947. The Second World War was over. Hollywood was producing movies at a never-before-seen pace as America was embracing affluence. However, there was a darker reality hidden beneath Tinseltown's flash and splendor. One where being loyal to oneself may result in immediate professional death and where studios controlled every element of their stars' lives. The big studios, you see, ran what was effectively a prison under a false pretense of paradise. They set rules about who you could be seen with, what you could eat at, and even who you could be married to. This meant leading parallel lives of complex deception for actors who didn't conform to the traditional model of American sexuality. The studio system that included notorious people like Louis B. Jack Warner at Warner Brothers and Mayer at MGM fostered a culture of dread fixers, whose only responsibility it was to prevent controversies from making the news, were employed by these influential figures. The most well-known of these was Eddie Manx at MGM, who paid off would-be blackmailers, set up fictitious marriages, and ensured that what transpired behind closed doors remained behind closed doors. Even though the studio system was starting to fall apart in the 1950s when Paul Newman was born, it still had almost complete control over people's personal lives. Newman's striking blue eyes and captivating appearance made him a leading man who gained access to the most closely kept secrets in the business. Newman lived long enough to witness a different period in Hollywood, one in which the truth about some of these celebrities started to come to light, in contrast to many of his peers. According to those closest to him, Newman considered the toll these secrets had on some of the best talents he had ever encountered in his last days. Before his death in 2008, Newman reportedly informed a close friend that the tragedy was more than simply something they had to hide. Everyone pretended not to know, which was the true tragedy. The collective deception of that sort affects a person's soul. What many in the industry had been whispering about for decades would eventually come to light when Newman exposed details about 6 of Hollywood's most adored male stars. These weren't merely hearsay. These were the real-life experiences of men who, in order to maintain their employment and, in certain situations, their very freedom, had to ignore basic facts about themselves. Before revealing the entire scope of Newman's shocking admissions, however, we must first comprehend how risky it was to be different during the heyday of Hollywood. There was more to being a gay person than scandal. Arrest, incarceration, and total career ruin could result from it. The answer from the studio? Provide their precious stars with elaborate heterosexual personas, including arranged marriages, paid female companions for public appearances, and a press that was either complicit in the hoax or totally duped by it. And millions of admirers never realized the truth about their film idols because the deceit was so thorough. Despite leading a completely different life behind closed doors, the first of these idols, a man whose name came to represent tough American masculinity, played a crucial part in the fight to keep Europe and humanity safe from the fascist danger. Was Rock Hudson involved? Hollywood's worst delusion. America was stunned when Rock Hudson passed away in 1985 from problems related to AIDS. How could this romantic lead who made women drool, this epitome of machismo, have been gay? The response is straightforward but devastating. Because his entire public image had been carefully crafted to conceal his true identity, Hollywood insiders were aware of Rock Hudson's predicament, according to what Paul Newman disclosed in private discussions near the end of his life. More than most, Rock suffered. According to reports, Newman stated, everyone in the industry knew, but since he was Universal's biggest revenue generator, the lie had to be kept up at all costs. Henry Wilson, Hudson's agent, was an expert at promoting very attractive young men while closely monitoring their personal life. According to reports, Wilson organized Hudson's 1955 marriage to Phyllis Gates, his secretary. The 3-year union was successful in putting an end to speculation over the actor's sexual orientation. The public's total acceptance of the deception is what makes Hudson's account so moving. This tall, attractive leading guy, who featured opposite Doris Day in popular romantic comedies, was the object of women's fantasies across America. They had no idea that Hudson was leading a very different life away from the TV. Newman recounted seeing Hudson struggle for himself. He reportedly confessed that there was usually this tension during industry parties. Everyone in the room knew it was theater, but Rock would show up with whichever female partner the studio had set up. He had to perform all the time, even when the cameras weren't filming, and you could see the toll it took on him. It was getting harder and harder for Hudson to keep up this facade. He took chances, often going to underground clubs where he could be himself for a moment. These true moments were fraught with peril. His career may have terminated in an instant due to exposure. Hudson concealed his AIDS diagnosis for as long as possible after receiving a diagnosis in 1984. Rumors started to circulate after his skinny appearance on Dynasty, and the story he had been telling for decades started to fall apart. America was forced to reconcile the image they had treasured with the true Hudson after his death in 1985. Everything changed after Rock's death. It made the lying seem not just cruel, but ultimately futile. According to Newman, after all those years of concealment, the truth eventually surfaced. However, Hudson wasn't alone in his struggle. Another outstanding actor of the time led a similar double life, albeit one that took different turns. That's the point, though. If it's entertaining and scares you, then people enjoy it, and people always talk about Psycho and Unconscious with a smile. Anthony Perkins, the man behind Norman Bates, the disturbed motel owner in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, created one of the most memorable characters in film. The irony is that, while he was bringing this complicated, troubled character to life on screen, Perkins was grappling with his own complex identity behind the scenes. According to Paul Newman's confidants, Perkins lived in constant fear of being revealed. In contrast to Rock Hudson, who portrayed straightforward masculinity, Perkins frequently portrayed characters with psychological depth and inner conflict. Newman reportedly stated that the scrutiny increased after Psycho made him famous, and he was afraid that his private life would be made public and that people would somehow relate Norman's problems to his own personal struggles. What few people knew was that Perkins reportedly had relationships with a number of male actors and dancers during the height of his career, which made it even harder for the studios to manage his public image. The solution was to create a story about an introverted, sensitive artist who had little time for romance because he was focused on his craft. The pressure eventually led Perkins to undergo therapy specifically aimed at changing his sexual orientation, a practice now discredited but common at the time. Newman said that Tony would occasionally show up at private industry gatherings and be a different person entirely, more relaxed, more himself, and then the next day he'd be back to the carefully constructed public persona. According to Newman, Tony's story is especially tragic because he internalized so much of society's judgment. He later married photographer Barry Berenson in 1973 and had 2 sons with her. By all accounts, he was devoted to his family, though friends suggested his personal journey remained complicated. Perkins's death from AIDS in 1992 shocked many who were unaware of his struggles, and Tony, who had seen how Hudson's illness had been sensationalized, kept his diagnosis a secret almost to the end, in contrast to others who accepted themselves privately while putting on a public show. James Dean, rebel with many causes, is the next actor on our list. His short, brilliant career continues to fascinate film lovers decades after his untimely death. The fuller picture of his life only became apparent after his death. After all those years of concealment, the truth eventually surfaced. However, Hudson wasn't alone in his struggle. Another outstanding actor of the time led a similar double life, albeit one that took different turns. That's the point, though. If it's entertaining and scares you, then people enjoy it, and people always talk about Psycho and Unconscious with a smile. Anthony Perkins, the man behind Norman Bates, the disturbed motel owner in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, created one of the most memorable characters in film. The irony is that, while he was bringing this complicated, troubled character to life on screen, Perkins was grappling with his own complex identity behind the scenes. According to Paul Newman's confidants, Perkins lived in constant fear of being revealed. In contrast to Rock Hudson, who portrayed straightforward masculinity, Perkins frequently portrayed characters with psychological depth and inner conflict. Newman reportedly stated that the scrutiny increased after Psycho made him famous, and he was afraid that his private life would be made public and that people would somehow relate Norman's problems to his own personal struggles. What few people knew was that Perkins reportedly had relationships with a number of male actors and dancers during the height of his career, which made it even harder for the studios to manage his public image. The solution was to create a story about an introverted, sensitive artist who had little time for romance because he was focused on his craft. The pressure eventually led Perkins to undergo therapy specifically aimed at changing his sexual orientation, a practice now discredited but common at the time. Newman said that Tony would occasionally show up at private industry gatherings and be a different person entirely, more relaxed, more himself, and then the next day he'd be back to the carefully constructed public persona. According to Newman, Tony's story is especially tragic because he internalized so much of society's judgment. He later married photographer Barry Berenson in 1973 and had 2 sons with her. By all accounts, he was devoted to his family, though friends suggested his personal journey remained complicated. Perkins's death from AIDS in 1992 shocked many who were unaware of his struggles, and Tony, who had seen how Hudson's illness had been sensationalized, kept his diagnosis a secret almost to the end, in contrast to others who accepted themselves privately while putting on a public show. James Dean, rebel with many causes, is the next actor on our list. His short, brilliant career continues to fascinate film lovers decades after his untimely death. The fuller picture of his life only became apparent after his death. Perhaps no star of the era inspired more speculation than this man. James Dean's performances in just 3 major films, East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant, made him one of the most captivating characters on screen ever, but his true identity has been the subject of decades of speculation. In his 24 years, he accomplished more than most actors do in their lifetimes. Jimmy didn't seem to worry as much about the norms, and Paul Newman, who collaborated with Dean on a television production early in their careers, reportedly remarked in his latter years that Dean was maybe the most unapologetically fearless of his contemporaries when it came to his personal life. In contrast to the meticulously controlled Rock Hudson or the conflicted Anthony Perkins, Dean appeared to live more defiantly, while still adhering to the rules required to sustain his booming career. Newman reportedly disclosed that he pushed boundaries in every aspect of his life, including who he loved. Dean's rebellious persona wasn't merely a screen creation, it reflected his approach to the constrictive society around him. According to several biographers and testimonies from those who knew him, Dean had important relationships with women, including actress Pirangeli, but he also had relationships with men. Newman reportedly described Dean as fluid in ways that confused the studio heads, who were unsure of how to categorize him and leaned into the rebel image, hoping the public wouldn't look too closely at the rest. Because of his complexity, he was especially hard for the studio system to control. According to Newman, the reason Jimmy was hazardous to the establishment was that he was hard to categorize, and anything that couldn't be put in a simple box scared the studios because they couldn't control it. Jimmy might have been the one who changed everything if he had lived. Dean's early death in a car accident in 1955 permanently frozen him in time as the ultimate symbol of beautiful troubled youth. In death, he became whatever audiences wanted him to be. The contradictions and ambiguities that supposedly characterized his life were smoothed over, and the sanitized image of the rebel became the official narrative. Dean was not the only sensitive, complex actor whose true self was kept hidden from the public during Hollywood's golden age. Another troubled talent struggled even more openly with the contradiction between his public image and private reality. Newman reportedly reflected that he didn't have the temperament to maintain the facade for decades like some did. Something would have given way. I don't know if I'm for you or against you because I don't know you well enough. It's about you and Angela and this talk that's going around about you getting married right now. Montgomery Clift's beautiful agony. Montgomery Clift's vulnerability and intensity on screen changed the way men perform in Hollywood. Behind his extraordinary talent, however, was a deep personal struggle. Paul Newman, who knew Clift and admired his innovative acting style, reportedly spoke of him with particular compassion. His work in films such as From Here to Eternity, A Place in the Sun, and The Misfits revealed a depth never before seen in American cinema. Clift found the deception increasingly intolerable, and his internal conflicts, coupled with the trauma of a devastating car accident in 1956 that permanently changed his appearance, led to an increased dependence on alcohol and pain medication. Monty was the most sensitive of all of us. Newman reportedly claimed that he couldn't separate himself from his characters, and he couldn't separate his personal pain from his art. Everything bled together, the contradiction tore him apart. Clift's relationships with men were more publicly acknowledged in Hollywood than those of many of his peers, but they were still kept a secret from the public. Newman reportedly reflected that Monty's tragedy was not simply that he had to hide who he was, but that the hiding itself became impossible for someone so unvarnished and authentic in his art. One of the few places where he felt free to be himself was his friendship with Elizabeth Taylor, who was ahead of her time in many ways, fully accepted Cliff, and became his fierce protector. Elizabeth understood Monty in a way that few others did, and Newman said she provided him with a safe haven in a field that offered very few beyond friendship or romance. They saw something fundamental in one another. As Cliff's personal problems worsened, he was unable to keep up the required public persona, and studios were less willing to collaborate with him, not just because of his health and dependability problems, but also because it was getting more difficult to control his public image within the constrained parameters of the era. The strain of being Montgomery Cliff for the public while being himself in private had simply become too much to bear. Cliff's struggle was especially evident to those in the industry, but other stars of the era found different ways to navigate the treacherous waters of fame and the shadow of secrets. Newman reportedly said that Monty's death felt almost inevitable to those who knew him well. Cliff died in 1966 at the age of 45. The all-American boy, Tab Hunter, embodied the clean-cut all-American image that Hollywood loved to promote in the 1950s. Blonde, handsome, and athletic, Hunter became a teen idol and starred in dozens of films that capitalized on his wholesome appeal. Do you ever have depressions or spells of melancholy? I'm unhappy right now. On the one hand, Tab's image was so aggressively all-American that there was more pressure to maintain it, but on the other hand, Jack Warner personally protected him because he was such a valuable commodity. As Paul Newman reportedly shared years later, Tab's situation was both better and worse than some others. However, the public image was a carefully constructed illusion, as was the case with so many stars of the era. In fact, Warner allegedly struck a deal to forego details about another star in order to protect his investment in Hunter's career when the scandal magazine Confidential threatened to reveal Hunter's attendance at a limp-wrist pajama party and their derogatory language up behind the scenes. Hunter had a relationship with actor Anthony Perkins and later a long-term partnership with producer Alan Blazer. Hunter later confirmed in his 2005 autobiography, Tab Hunter Confidential, what Newman and others had long known, that his studio's arranged dates with actresses like Natalie Wood and Debbie Reynolds were pure fiction meant to maintain his marketable image. Not everyone was that lucky. Hunter's career suffered when he bought out his contract with Warner Brothers in search of more serious roles. Newman reportedly said he stepped away from the center of the Hollywood machine and found a quieter life where he could be more himself. Tab was able to find some peace in later years. Perhaps the most poignant story among the stars Newman discussed is that of an actor whose brief career contained enormous promise cut short by tragedy. Hunter lived long enough to reclaim his narrative and tell his own story, unlike some of his contemporaries, despite the fact that his opportunities diminished without the studio's protection. Hunter passed away in 2018 at the age of 86, having witnessed enormous social changes that would have seemed impossible during his years as a heartthrob. Sal Mano ahead of his time. Sal Mano received Oscar nods for his roles in Rebel Without a Cause and Exodus, making him one of Hollywood's most promising young talents. I'm not feeling so bright. It's a transient ailment. You good, Rocky? I've been worrying about you. Paul Newman, who collaborated with Mano on Exodus, spoke of him with special admiration, saying, "S had a courage that was rare in those days." His dark good looks and sensitive performance style made him instantly recognizable to moviegoers of the 1950s and early 1960s. Newman reportedly shared that he wasn't as willing to play the game as some others. As he grew older, Mino found it difficult to move from teenage roles, especially as he became less willing to hide his true self. Unlike many of his contemporaries who maintained elaborate facades throughout their careers, Mano eventually lived more openly, especially in his theater work. That integrity cost him professionally, but he seemed to have fewer regrets. Mano's later career included directing and producing projects that were groundbreaking in their treatment of same-sex themes, such as a 1969 Los Angeles production of the play Fortune in Men's Eyes that was revolutionary in its frankness. S was likely the most honest of that generation of actors, and Newman reportedly reflected that he reached a point where he could no longer participate in the charade even though he knew it would limit his opportunities in film. His artistic integrity held firm even as his film roles dwindled. Mano was tragically killed in a robbery attempt outside his West Hollywood apartment in 1976 at the age of 37, ending what could have been a spectacular comeback in a career that had always been characterized by audacity and genuineness. The painful cost of secrecy. The stories of these 6 extraordinary talents, Rock Hudson, Anthony Perkins, James Dean, Montgomery Clift, Tab Hunter, and Salman Mano, reveal a hidden history of Hollywood's golden age. Newman reportedly said he was already pushing boundaries that others wouldn't approach for decades. Who knows what he might have accomplished if he had lived longer? Paul Newman, who navigated the same era while projecting a conventional public image with his long marriage to Joanne Woodward, reportedly reflected on the profound unfairness of the system he witnessed, saying near the end of his life, "The tragedy is that these men weren't allowed to be whole." Beneath the glamorous facade, there were lives of painful compromise, emotional struggle, and necessary deception. The pressure to maintain these divisions created unbearable strain, and for some, like Montgomery Clift, it contributed to destructive behaviors that shortened their lives. They had to fragment themselves, the public self, the private self, with no chance of integration. That takes a terrible psychological toll. Even those who survived into more tolerant times, like Tab Hunter, lost decades of genuine living to a system that prioritized marketability over humanity. Newman reportedly questioned his own role in this system. "We were all complicit to some degree." For others, like Rock Hudson, it meant living a life of elaborate fiction until illness made that impossible. The culture that demanded these sacrifices was not exclusive to Hollywood, it reflected broader American attitudes of the time. But the movie industry amplified these pressures through the global visibility of its stars and the financial interests invested in their images. Those of us who knew remained silent because that's how things worked, and I've often wondered if we could have changed things sooner if more of us had spoken up. According to reports, Newman said, "There's something almost heroic in that, not that some broke under the pressure, but that so many found ways to endure it while still creating beautiful, truthful art."